Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Clint Stone Chapter 12 Purpose, written by some guy named Ted. We are gathered here today to say goodbye. Karis Leon was killed in the line of duty working to make the galaxy a better place. There are a few dozen gathered before the hole in the ground. A male Skillen stood at the head of the grave, dressed in ceremonial burial robes of the Skillen religion. Karis had been a devout worshipper, and so he was buried in accordance with his beliefs, naked, except for the white cloth wrapped around his waist that covered the sweet-smelling oil. He was buried with nothing between him and the earth. His head had been masterfully sewn back onto his body. It seems almost undetectable, unless you looked really closely at them. A small mercy for his son Hiru. Jane stood by the grave, listening to the priest give his last rites. She stood, but she still did not listen. She was absorbed in her memories. She remembered the first time that she had seen Karis, how he had smiled and been so welcoming. She remembered when her father had disowned her for choosing something unworthy of her breeding, and how Karis had basically become her father, giving her advice and just being there for her when she needed help. She remembered how Karis had always taken time out of every day, no matter what he was doing, to spend time with his son. Hiru stood next to her, stiff upper lip and a rigid back. The boy was 10 years old, and he was trying to be 20. He was an orphan now. She didn't know what would happen to him. She knew his mother had family on Yearn, but she didn't know if they would go there. She gave the young boy on the sidearm a hug, pulling him tight, as she pushed off her, trying to look tough. But he relented and allowed her to hug him tight. He needed someone to hold on to just as much as she did. Jane thought about assuming a hard face and purging herself of emotion, but she did not. She had always been herself around Karis when she could be, never using a manner around him. She would do so as she saw him to the next life. And so we give him back to the mother, who will watch and protect him until such time that he is risen again. The priest finished his ritual and nodded his head. The mourners each walked up to the grave and, kissing their fingertips, held their right hand above the body. They let their hand drop and they departed. One by one they did this until only 3 were left: Hiru, Jane, and Clint Stone. The tall human stood beside the grave and bowed his head. His lips moved, but Jane could not hear what he said. When he finished, he lifted his head and walked around the grave. He bent down on one knee before Hiru, and he looked at him. "How are you doing?" he asked, his voice oddly gentle and soft for such a big being. Hiru shrugged, his eyes trained on the ground. Clint nodded in understanding. "I know, everyone has asked you that, and you're sick of hearing it. I know, I was." Hiru looked up at Clint. Clint gave a half smile. "My dad died too, when I was about your age." Jane looked in surprise as Clint told the story of how his dad had died of a sickness, and how Clint had been so hurt and lonely for a long time. "He was my best friend, you know. He was always there for me, ready to play baseball or read me a story. And then he wasn't." Jane could see Hiru nodding as Clint talked. He didn't know what baseball was. Jane didn't either, but he knew what Clint was talking about. He told Hiru about how it got easier over time and how his father would always be in his heart. It was a big concept for a 10-year-old, but things could get better after such a loss. But Clint said it so convincingly and heartfelt that Jane knew Hiru believed him. She hadn't known this human had the gentle side to him. The only sides of Clint Stone that she'd seen were the violent and passionate. It surprised her, but it made her feel better. She knew the words were meant for Hiru, but she also meant for something to her too. The sorrow was still there, but it was lessened. "Do you want to say goodbye?" Clint asked Hiru. The boy nodded. Clint nodded over to the grave. "I'll give you some time alone." The boy slowly made his way to his father's grave. Clint put his hands on his knee and pushed himself up next to Jane. She looked up at him. It was a long way up. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure how to talk to him. I'm sorry to hear your father die. Sickness is a terrible way to go." Clint shrugged. He didn't die of sickness. He died in the bombardment along with the rest of humanity. "But you just told him." He gave a sad half smile, identical to the one he gave Hiru. I told him what he needed to hear. Jane didn't know what to make of that. What will happen to him? Clint asked, his green eyes watching the young boy. He'll be staying with some friends for a while, she said. He's got an aunt of his own, but I don't know how to find her. I'll look into it, Clint said. Jane was grateful for that. Hero returned and turned around to walk over to her. I'll walk with you, said Clint. They set off into the city in the distance. You two never cease to amaze. I sent you to the fleet of bodyguards to impress the warlord enough that he would sign a treaty, and you come back as the warlord. I dare say that if I sent you out to scouting mission and you would return with the lost treasure of Albaba. But I'm not sending you out on a scouting mission. I'm giving you a week's rest. God knows you've earned it, and then you will report to General Noromak. He has an assignment to which you two are particularly well suited. Now get out of here and enjoy some hard-earned rest. That was what Scour had told us after we had returned. Now I wandered the city, looking for something, anything to do. I had gone to the funeral for Karis and I had paid my respects. I had intended to do something with Clint, but I'd seen him with Lady Knight, and I knew that I wasn't going to be seeing much of him in the next week, between now and when we started to work with Noromak. So I wandered the city. It was beautiful. Each building was a work of art, lovingly crafted. They seemed to be a solid piece, formed of that strange rock and metal material. The lines and the planes of the buildings seemed to flow together with a simple grace, giving the impression of water rushing over the rocks and stream bed. Where two streets met, there was a large open squares, surrounded by tall buildings, with a single statue or a fountain in the center. I walked through the outskirts from the graveyard where the rebellion buried their dead, a large open stretch of dirt in the north of the city. I think it was the north, but it was difficult to tell in this underground city. The only way to really know where you were was by using the giant pillar as a guidance system. A small of the Remen explained to me that when I asked how to find the 5th Street. There were 10 pillars around the city, each with a distinctive feature. 4 of them were in the residential sector, 2 in the market sector, and 4 again in the industrial. Out of the 4 residential sector, they were positioned in such a way that they were out of the 4 corners of the sector. They were each a different color, a full sight of the builders of the city. The green one was around which streets first through 50th were situated around. The red one was 50th to 100, yellow 100th through 250th, and the blue one was the rest through 200th. There was an easy part. The residents had numbered streets, making it easy to navigate. The market had over 100 streets, all named after some being or another. At least there was an alphabetical order. But no one had gotten around to naming the industrial streets. Those were navigated using pillars and go 4 streets past Taylor's and then go right, follow the road 3 more streets and then turn left. It was a bad system, but the people who worked there knew it and felt no need to change it. I found myself wandering this area between the market and the residence, a place full of taverns and places of lesser morals. Every city had them, and I suppose that being in a city dedicated to fighting half the galaxy deserved a little break from the reality now and then. I passed several establishments and helped in that capacity, on my way to 50th Street and the house Clint and I had been assigned to during our leave. I heard laughter coming from one of them, and I stopped. Damn it, don't go in there. But I did. Clint was warm. Very warm. That was one of the things Jane really enjoyed about him. She lay against his broad chest, her head on his shoulder. Her toes reached somewhere around his mid-shin. They had spent the better part of the night experiencing even greater pleasure. Now that they lay against each other, they took comfort in another's closeness. Her hand rested on his chest, and she felt the rise and fall of each breath that Clint took. The size of him was still surprising, even now. His arm was cradled around her, gently and lovingly, but she knew if he wanted to, he could crush her with a sudden movement. His metal arm was hard against her side, unyielding. The rest of her body was firm, but it did have some give. The metal did not, but it was as warm as the rest of his body, and she did not mind. But while the feel of it was hard, the motions it could perform were anything but. Clint gently stroked her back, a simple gesture, but one that was full of meaning. In return, she snuggled tighter against him, burying her face into his shoulder. They lay there for a long while, taking simple pleasure in knowing that someone was there. Jane turned her face up to Clint. She smiled wryly. "There aren't any other women that I need to know about, are there? You know, a dashing rogue like you traveling across the galaxy. Surely." She trailed off, watching his face grow dark and then return to normal. He shook his head. "No one." Jane knew that there was more. Diplomats are trained to detect body language and when something is not as it should be. But there was one. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He did not answer, his face unreadable. She had spent time with most species in the galaxy and hundreds of individuals. None of them could disguise their thoughts like Clint Stone. That is not to say that he did not show emotion, just that when he chose, he could be as expressionless as a rock wall. "Someone from Earth?" she asked. "Yes," he replied curtly, a hard edge to his voice. She was dead then. Jane did not pry. He would tell her in his own time. She slid a hand down his chest onto his side and gave him a hug, letting him know that someone was there. Not that he didn't know already, but she reminded him. She changed the subject. "Where did you learn to fight? I've never seen anyone fight the way you do." He inhaled, his chest rising, and her body rose with it. The strength of those lungs were tremendous. She knew that from his kisses, she was left breathless and gasping for air, and he seemed unaffected. "I learned most of it on Earth, but I never had a use for it there. I didn't even like fighting back on Earth. But then I was brought out here, and now it's all I do. I feel like I have no other purpose." She nuzzled into him. "But you make such a difference." "Do I?" he said, his voice bitter. "I fight off thugs and the swarm and murderers, but then I turn around and there are twice as many. No matter what I do, there are always more. It seems pointless." She pushed herself up, her hands on his chest. "Never say that. You saved thousands of lives. Everywhere you go, the good speak in awe of the man who has come to save them. The bad flee in terror. You are a beacon in this galaxy of darkness, and that makes all the difference in the world." His starting green eyes stared into hers, unbelieving. "But I do it through violence and death. How long before they look at me in fear and revulsion? Look at that. There walks the killer of thousands." Jane poked him in the chest with a finger. "You do not just kill. Today you spoke to a young boy and let him know the world wasn't ending. You rescued thousands of beings on Buria. You even came here. The people spoke to a tall stranger who saved young girls on Flodens, who walked into burning stations to save hundreds of beings that he didn't know. Hero was one of those, right? You make a difference, Clint Stone, and you have a purpose." He looked at her in the eyes. A mix of joy and relief and love was almost enough to overwhelm her. "Thank you," he said. He gripped her under his arms and pulled her on top of him, drawing her face in for a long kiss, his rough beard tickling her cheeks. The inside of the bar was loud and dimly lit. Smoke from the various pipes and tubes filled the air. I sat at the head of a long table, arm around a pretty Raccoon named Wyena. I think it was Wyena. My head was a little fuzzy, and my vision was a little blurry. My throat was wet, and my limbs did not respond as they should have. The joys of alcohol. This bar was a singular in the city for serving alcohol. They did not serve it in great mugs like Clint drank, but tiny drops diluted in vast amounts of water. As most beings could not process alcohol, too much could kill them. But just a tiny bit was enough to bring the effects with only a headache and a sore body in the morning. I had nothing to do for a week, so I could afford it. I tossed back the shot in front of me, the crowd cheering. It seems the newcomers to the spa, the jumping Milax, were required to drink as much alcohol shots as they could for the first night. After that, they could come and go as they pleased. I was on my 15th, some sort of record for the place. I had full control of my faculties. I would have realized that I should have been dead after the 10th. I realized that in the morning. But for now, I lost in the joys of competition. Besides drinking, this place had a reputation for the wrong sort of gambling, where the stakes were high and the losses big, and I was soaring high. I laid down the cards in my hand and laughed joyfully. 4 regents and an emperor. I won that hand, my 5th in a row. The 4 beings around the table scowled as they relinquished their money. "Who is next?" I slurred. I was feeling good. I had never felt anything like this before. My head floated high and my fingers tingled. Actually, my whole arm was tingling. The 4 beings across the table shook their heads in disgust and threw their cards down on the table. They pushed the chairs back and stalked off. "Do you wish to go somewhere more private?" whispered Waena in my ear. "I would very much like that." I stood and clutched the table for balance. I grinned and lifted my arms. "Thanks for the night. Drinks are on me until this runs out," I said as I slapped a large pile of my winnings onto the bar. The bartender swept it off before any of the patrons could. The air outside of the bar was cool on my face. "Where to?" I asked Waena. Her long, curled ears twitched as she looked at me. "I have a house not far from here." I raised my eyebrow. "Then, let's go." End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you wish to support the author, there is a link to the original story, so pop over there and give him your support. If you wish to support this channel, however, there are a few ways to do so. The best and easiest would be to share this video with other people, as well as liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. All of these things tell the algorithm that this channel is at least vaguely interesting, and that may share it with other people. If you wish to support the channel in some other manner, watching my other videos would also help tremendously. Or, if you really like, there is a link down below to leave a tip or to join the Patreon. Any and all support is very much appreciated. And I hope that you all have a good one until the next time, and I'll see you then. Cheers.